So being able to brace really hard and create a ton of tension within the trunk is only half the equation when it comes to stability. I love training for strength and I want all my athletes to be strong no matter what sport they're in, but being strong is fucking useless if you don't know how to apply it and your body doesn't actually have the capacity to use it in the context that you need it for. Today I want to dive in a little deeper, more from an athletic context on what it means to have a strong core and how that actually carries over into the context of our sport and how it improves our performance. Because when it comes to actually training the muscles of the trunk or our core strength, however you want to say it, there are so many different ways we can go about it, how we can load it, different planes of movement that we have to account for. But the big thing I want to differentiate between today is just creating this anticipatory trunk stiffness, loading that we can be ready to handle versus reactive trunk stiffness. So when I talk about creating trunk stiffness, what this means is basically getting all those muscles in your trunk, in your core, to activate and create this tension in order to stabilize the spine. Because we know that the spine alone does not have a huge capacity to actually stabilize itself. Those ligaments only do so much. The muscles are the main thing that's actually creating that stability in our spinal column. And one thing that we try to teach our athletes early on when they're learning to lift weights is this idea of bracing. So abdominal bracing is basically just tensing all those muscles in your trunk to create that tension so we don't have unnecessary movement when we're performing our exercises. And this is especially important for our movements like the squat and the deadlift, where we're really loading up the spine and have to limit movement as much as possible to prevent any sort of damage. But it's also necessary for most closed chain exercises we do where we're trying to maximize force output into the ground. Now, when it comes to most movements, we really don't want to have a lot of movement occurring at our lumbar spine. The lumbar region of our spine is meant to be stable. It's not designed to undergo a lot of movement compared to, say, our thoracic spine. So when it comes to performing, active movements, it's okay to have that movement through our thoracic spine, but to have that efficient, transfer of force, we need that stiffness in our lumbar spine, in our lumbopelvic region. So just as it's important to be strong through our trunk in producing movement, we almost have to be more proficient in actually resisting movement. And so often we'll categorize exercises where we have to resist flexion, extension, rotation as these anti-exercises, anti-extension, anti-rotation, etc. Because our extremities are what are ultimately producing the movement. Our spine acts as that medium for force transfer between the lower limb and the upper limb. And obviously in cases like throwing a ball, or as I previously discussed in another video, running, we're gonna have rotation through our thoracic spine in coordination with our hips and our lower limb. But being able to create, that isometric, that static tension, that stiffness in our core is a huge component of athletic performance and a lot of the movements that we are going to perform. But sometimes I think there can be a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to actually creating stiffness in the trunk and seeing how that transfers to sport. And I want to use bracing with our big lifts like our squat as a prime example for this. So say we're back squatting and we unrack the bar, we're getting set up. Before we go down, we're going to have the athlete brace, tense those muscles to create that kind of collective involvement from all the muscles in the trunk and not just, the paraspinal ones, the back muscles that are keeping the trunk from just collapsing forward. So we can ultimately create more stiffness and stabilize the spine more by getting those muscles working during the movement. And this can take a lot of time to get right and feel what it's supposed to feel like, but once you do, you'll find that your athletes will be quite a bit stronger, especially when it comes to any sort of lower limb movements, because you're getting a lot less power leakage from any excess movement that's happening at your spine when you're trying to push that force into the ground. Because that connection between, your upper extremity, your torso, and your lower limb is a lot more rigid. And so bracing is really a skill in itself. And there's research to show that by training athletes or training individuals to brace properly, they actually increase hip extension power. So our push off when we're sprinting, our extension when we're jumping, all these things, we actually become more explosive because of our ability to create trunk stiffness. And there's also research to show that when we cue our athletes to actually brace those muscles, we can double the amount of activity that we get in the trunk musculature. And this doesn't necessarily mean that by doubling the activity in the core muscles that we can handle twice the amount of load, because that's probably not the case. But what we do know about when a muscle increases in activity is, one, it's probably recruiting more muscle fibers as a whole, and two, it can handle a lot more force, a lot more tension. But the distinction I want to make today is more around the difference between anticipating that loading and creating that stiffness when we know it's going to be there, and then reactively creating that stiffness to an outside stimulus that we don't actually know how much loading is going to occur, where it's going to occur, and actually being able to react to scenarios like that. All of the muscles and joints in our body have these sensors in them, and the sensors kind of detect changes in loading, changes in stress, anything that's occurring within the body, internal, external. And it sends this feedback to the brain so that the brain can make a decision on how it's going to move forward based on this feedback. So when it comes to actually producing movement, we're able to reduce the amount of harmful stress that our body experiences. Whenever your joints experience some high level of loading or stress, they're going to respond by making stability. Your brain is going to sense that stress, and it's going to get those muscles firing to limit movement. This is something you can't really avoid. Your body is going to sense an increase in stress, and it doesn't want damage to occur, so it creates stability. And this is especially true in the case of our spine. We have a ton of important structures running through our spinal column. We've got our spinal cord, ligaments, arteries, all these things that we need to prevent damage to. So when you put a 400-pound barbell on your back, it doesn't really matter if you're bracing or not. You're going to have some level of activity occurring in your trunk, because if you didn't, you would literally just collapse. Bracing is really just an additional strategy that we can use to encourage more holistic activity within the trunk to further increase stability. But that's the thing, when you're lifting weights, it's easy to create that stability because you know when it's going to occur. Your body is going to get ready when you unrack that weight in your 400-pound squat, and then you can further take the time to create more stability within the trunk. You're able to get ready to respond to that loading. Your body is ready to create that tension, create that stiffness to keep you in a safe position. So typically, if you experience an injury during something like a heavy squat or deadlift, assuming you don't have any underlying issues occurring there, it's probably just going to be from tissue overload, where the fibers physically could not handle any more tension on them during the movement. And people that don't know how to brace properly are typically more prone to having, injuries of their low back muscles, because those muscles are trying to do all of the work in maintaining that positioning and don't have as much help from those other trunk muscles that could be kind of attributing to that stability. But creating this reactive stiffness is a little bit different, because you don't necessarily know when your spine is going to experience this high loading or loading in general. So in a team sport setting or any sport where you have to respond to some sort of external stimuli, in most cases you're probably going to have to create trunk stiffness in response to something. So let's say you're a ball carrier in a sport like rugby or football, and you have to plant to change directions to avoid getting tackled. So every time you plant, you need to create that trunk stiffness. Every time someone grabs onto you or someone hits you, you have to be able to create that stiffness to limit damage. Contact sports aside, any time that we have to plant into the ground and change direction very suddenly, especially in reaction to a stimulus that's very, very quick, we have to be able to create that stiffness in our trunk so that we have efficient force transfer into the ground to propel us forward or in whatever direction we're trying to go. So as I mentioned earlier, and as we should already know, our spine houses a lot of important structures. So it's really important that we don't have a lot of excessive movement there, a lot of excessive stress. But the good thing is that some of the muscles in our low back have a ton of sensors in them that can really, really easily and really closely detect changes in movement. Our lumbar vertebrae don't have a lot of movement capacity to begin with. So the amount of movement that's actually stressful for our lumbar vertebrae and the ligaments that innervate on it compared to something like our shoulder is a lot harder to detect. Luckily, our multifidus muscles, so these little muscles that kind of go down each side of our spinal column, connecting vertebrae to vertebrae. Some expand a little further, but there's these little muscles on each side of our spine that have a ton of sensors in them. They have a really high density of muscle spindles, so these sensors that can detect change in length. So not a lot of movement actually has to occur for those muscles to realize maybe we should get all these muscles working in order to limit that. So our multifidi play a huge role in kind of telling our brain when we need to create that stiffness and create that tension. Individuals with low back pain tend to have atrophy within those multifidus muscles. So if we experience any sort of really sudden stress and those sensors aren't ready to kind of turn everything else on, that's putting a lot of strain, a lot of extra stress on those ligaments, on our vertebrae, all those passive structures that really don't have a lot of high tolerance to load. And this is really what it means to be able to create joint stability. It's not just about being able to produce a lot of force, it's being able to detect that feedback, having your muscles kind of detect the change in what's going on, send those signals to your brain, and being able to create an efficient response that enhances stability. So being able to brace really hard and create a ton of tension within the trunk is only half the equation when it comes to stability. It gives us the capacity to actually withstand force, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our brain, our neuromuscular system has the capacity to get those muscles firing when it needs to in a more kind of chaotic setting. And there's tons of ways that we can do this in training by incorporating more unpredictable stimuli into our exercises. There's ways that we can do this with partners where, you know, they may be knocking you off balance in some way. And again, we don't want to incorporate this to the extent that it takes away from the exercise either. Like, we can make something super unstable that could be, you know, really challenging to the body and to, you know, your brain to actually recruit those muscles, but it's so far out of the context of what we're doing that it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's really important that we attack both of those points, but also find that middle ground where it actually applies to the context of our sport. And I'm not saying that bracing or the ability to tolerate really high loads isn't carrying over to your sport performance. It's kind of like a football player having a 700-pound squat, but not actually having the power and the elasticity to apply that force to be explosive and actually be effective in their position. And I say it all the time, the famous Mark Bell quote, "Strength is never a weakness." I love training for strength and I want all my athletes to be strong no matter what sport they're in, but being strong is fucking useless if you don't know how to apply it and your body doesn't actually have the capacity to use it in the context that you need it for. So I hope this creates a little more understanding around core strength and what it means to anticipate loading versus actually react to an external stimulus and create that stiffness to kind of facilitate movement in the context of sport. Because at the end of the day, this is real life. Be ready to perform.